In May 1986, the quiet town of Hawkins, Texas, was shattered by a crime so violent it earned the killer the nickname the Animal. Jerry Walter McFadden, a career criminal with a long history of rape and assault, had once again been set free on parole. Just weeks later, he crossed paths with three young friends enjoying a spring afternoon. 18-year-old cheerleader Suzanne Denise Harrison, 20-year-old Gena Turner, and 19-year-old Bryan Boone. They had no way of knowing that their lives were about to collide with a predator. What happened next horrified East Texas. McFadden kidnapped, raped, and strangled Suzanne Harrison, while Gena Turner and Bryan Boone were also brutally murdered. When police finally closed in, McFadden escaped from jail, sparking one of the largest manhunts the state had ever seen. The headlines branded him a monster, and for once the nickname fit. By 1987, McFadden was sentenced to die for Harrison's murder. But his story didn't end there. In 2019, decades after his execution, advances in DNA technology would reveal that McFadden was also responsible for the 1979 cold case murder of 20-year-old Portland woman, Anna Marie Hlavka. Even in death, his crimes continued to haunt families hundreds of miles away. When McFadden was finally led to the death chamber on October 14, 1999, the families of his victims came face to face with the man who had destroyed so many lives. And in his final moments, Jerry Walter McFadden, the Animal, chose silence. He offered no apology, no statement, and no last words. To understand how a repeat offender slipped through the cracks, terrorized communities across 2 states, and left behind a trail of devastation that stretched from Texas to Oregon, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is a story of violence, justice, and unanswered questions that still echo decades later. Jerry Walter McFadden was born on March 21, 1948, in the rural setting of Haskell County, Texas, a small community where neighbors knew one another and life moved at a slower pace. But beneath that quiet backdrop, McFadden would grow into one of the state's most notorious predators. According to court records and reports later summarized in Wikipedia, McFadden's path into crime began early and escalated with disturbing speed. By 1973, at just 25 years old, he had already been convicted of rape, a conviction that marked the beginning of a long pattern of violent sexual assaults that would span decades. Despite his record, he was released and paroled multiple times, a decision that would have devastating consequences for countless innocent lives. ABC News later noted that McFadden repeatedly cycled through the justice system, serving short stints for heinous offenses only to be freed again, giving him opportunity after opportunity to reoffend. Local reporting, including coverage from Texas Public Radio, TPR, emphasized the deep frustration within law enforcement that such a dangerous individual had been allowed back onto the streets despite his well-documented history of violence. While McFadden's criminal behavior escalated, the young victims whose lives he would later claim were only just beginning to step into adulthood, filled with hope and promise. In Portland, Oregon, 20-year-old Anna Marie Hlavka was remembered by her family as a kind, hardworking young woman who supported herself with a job at McDonald's while sharing an apartment with her fiancé. The Washington Post reported that Anna had grown up close to her sister, Rose Ann, and the two maintained a strong bond as they navigated the challenges of young adulthood. On the night of July 24, 1979, Anna's life was brutally cut short, and for decades her family would live with unanswered questions about who had committed such a savage act. 7 years later, in East Texas, another set of bright young lives crossed paths with McFadden. Suzanne Denise Harrison, only 18 years old at the time, was a beloved high school student in Hawkins, Texas. Described by classmates and family as a cheerful, spirited teenager, she had been a member of her school's cheerleading team and was known for her warmth and kindness. Coverage in ABC News, the Los Angeles Times, and Wikipedia paints Suzanne as someone whose future brimmed with potential. Yet tragically, she would become the central victim in one of Texas's most shocking murder cases. Alongside Suzanne, that fateful May Day in 1986 were her friends Gena Turner, age 20, and Bryan Boone, just 19. Both were acquaintances who shared in the carefree joys of small-town life, heading out together on what should have been a simple, safe outing. Wikipedia and the Los Angeles Times note that Gena and Bryan were ordinary young adults with their whole lives ahead of them, connected by friendship and youth, unaware that their paths would cross with McFadden at the worst possible moment. Their names would later be forever linked to Suzanne's, bound together in the public record not by the joy of their companionship, but by the brutal violence that ended their lives. Together, these stories set the stage for a haunting timeline. A dangerous man who slipped through the cracks of the justice system again and again, and 4 young victims: Anna, Suzanne, Gena, and Bryan, whose stolen futures will become a lasting testament to the cost of systemic failure. On the night of July 24th, 1979, tragedy struck in Portland, Oregon, when 20-year-old Anna Marie Hlavka was found dead inside her apartment. According to reports from KATU, ABC News, and The Washington Post, Anna had been brutally sexually assaulted before being strangled to death with the cord of a clock radio, a chillingly ordinary household item turned into a weapon of murder. Detectives arriving at the scene were confronted with signs of a violent struggle, and though the horror was undeniable, the investigation quickly ran into the frustrations that often plagued cases in the pre-DNA era. Evidence was collected meticulously, and crucially, samples from beneath Anna's fingernails were preserved, holding microscopic clues that investigators would not yet have the technology to fully decipher. In the weeks and months that followed, Portland authorities questioned suspects and chased leads, but the trail soon went cold. For Anna's family, the years that stretched into decades brought only silence and sorrow, as her murder joined the long list of unsolved cases that haunted the city. Fast forward to May 1986, when hundreds of miles away in East Texas, Jerry Walter McFadden, a man already branded by courts as a violent sexual predator and yet again free on parole from prior rape convictions, set his sights on new victims. According to ABC News and Wikipedia, 18-year-old Suzanne Harrison, 20-year-old Gena Turner, and 19-year-old Bryan Boone had set out together for a casual outing, enjoying the easy rhythm of youth in the small town of Hawkins. What began as an innocent day would become a nightmare. McFadden abducted all 3, taking control in a way that would end their lives and devastate their community. Investigators later pieced together the grim details. Suzanne Harrison, the high school cheerleader filled with promise, was sexually assaulted and then strangled, her life ending in the cruelest way imaginable. Her companions, Gena Turner and Bryan Boone, were also killed, their youth extinguished in the same horrifying spree of violence. As Wikipedia records, the murders stunned East Texas, the brutality echoing far beyond the rural backdrop where they occurred. McFadden was soon apprehended, but in a move that revealed both his desperation and his dangerous cunning, he managed to escape custody less than 2 months later. On July 9, 1986, while being held in the Upshur County Jail, McFadden overpowered guards, seized a female jailer as a hostage, and fled. The Los Angeles Times and Wikipedia recount how this escape set off one of the largest manhunts in Texas history, with nearly 1,200 law enforcement officers mobilized to track him down across woods, fields, and back roads. The incident not only magnified his infamy, but also underscored the very real risk he continued to pose to anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. Though he was eventually recaptured, the damage had already been done. 3 young lives lost, a community terrorized, and the chilling realization that a man who had been flagged as a repeat offender for years had once again been given the chance to kill. Jerry Walter McFadden's escape in July 1986 triggered chaos across East Texas, but his freedom would be short-lived. According to Wikipedia, only 2 days after breaking out of the Upshur County Jail and taking a female jailer hostage, McFadden was tracked down by law enforcement officers in a massive manhunt that involved helicopters, bloodhounds, and more than 1,000 officers sweeping through the woods and rural backroads of the region. Exhausted and cornered, the animal was finally recaptured, bringing an end to the manhunt, but not to the fear and outrage that his crimes had ignited. With McFadden once again in custody, the focus shifted to the courts. In 1987, he was brought to trial for the brutal murders that had taken place the previous spring, with particular emphasis on the death of 18-year-old Suzanne Harrison. As recorded in Wikipedia, prosecutors laid out the evidence in stark detail, presenting the jury with a horrific sequence of events: Harrison's abduction, sexual assault, and strangulation, as well as the murders of her companions, Gena Turner and Bryan Boone. The case painted a picture of a man whose violence was not random, but part of a long, escalating pattern of predation. The jury had little difficulty in reaching its conclusion. They found McFadden guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to death, the ultimate penalty under Texas law. According to Genealogy law, McFadden immediately began the lengthy appeals process, challenging his conviction and death sentence through the state courts. His attorneys argued procedural errors and constitutional violations, but time and again, the courts upheld the verdict. Each appeal was another reminder for the victims' families of the long shadow his crimes had cast over their lives. During his years on death row at the Huntsville unit, McFadden continued to file petitions in hopes of delaying his execution, including a federal habeas corpus petition. As noted in Genealogy law, that final legal avenue was denied in 1999, clearing the way for Texas to set an execution date. After more than a decade of trials, appeals, and legal maneuvering, the end of McFadden's violent life was finally in sight. Though Jerry Walter McFadden was executed in 1999, his crimes did not end with his death, because nearly 2 decades later, investigators in Oregon would revisit the unsolved murder of Anna Marie Hlavka and discover that the case had never truly gone cold. It had simply been waiting for science to catch up. According to KATU, detectives had carefully preserved crucial evidence from a 1979 crime scene, including the DNA that was found under Anna's fingernails during her struggle with her killer. At the time, forensic science lacked the ability to identify an assailant from such samples, but those tiny biological traces held within them an unknown male DNA profile that would prove to be the key to solving the mystery decades later. By the late 2010s, forensic technology had entered a new era. The rise of genetic genealogy, a groundbreaking investigative method, allowed detectives to use DNA not just to match against criminal databases, but to trace through entire family trees. Companies like Parole Nanolabs and open-source platforms such as GeneMatch made it possible to identify relatives of unknown suspects by comparing DNA samples to thousands of voluntarily uploaded genetic profiles. As reported by ABC News and Texas Public Radio, TPR, this approach was revolutionizing cold case investigations across the country, finally giving law enforcement the tools to put names to long-unknown killers. In 2019, detectives in Portland turned these techniques toward the Hlavka case, and what they uncovered stunned even seasoned investigators. Using the preserved DNA, they ran the unknown male profile through genealogical databases and began mapping familial lines, slowly narrowing the pool of possible suspects. As ABC News and TPR documented, this meticulous process eventually pointed to the McFadden family, and by obtaining DNA samples from living relatives, detectives were able to make a definitive connection to Jerry Walter McFadden. Additional records confirmed that McFadden had in fact been in the Pacific Northwest at the time of Anna's murder, placing him in Oregon in July 1979. Reporting by OPB and ABC News highlighted the painstaking work, building out family trees, cross-referencing decades-old case files, and finally matching the preserved evidence to a man who had already been executed for other murders. For Anna's family, the revelation was both heartbreaking and relieving. As the Washington Post reported, her sister rose and described the discovery as a form of long-delayed closure, knowing at last the identity of the man who had taken Anna's life. For law enforcement, the case was a powerful demonstration of how perseverance and science could finally break the silence of decades-old crimes. Even though Jerry Walter McFadden was no longer alive to stand trial for Anna's murder, the resolution of her case underscored the importance of preserving evidence, pushing the boundaries of forensic technology, and never giving up on the pursuit of justice. As the 1990s drew to a close, The long legal battle over Jerry Walter McFadden's fate finally reached its conclusion. According to Wikipedia, after years of appeals and petitions challenging his conviction and sentence, all of which have been rejected by state and federal courts, Texas officials set his execution date for October 14, 1999, inside the Huntsville unit, the state's oldest prison and home to its death chamber. In the days leading up to his execution, McFadden's attorneys made final efforts to delay the inevitable, but those appeals were denied, clearing the way for the state to carry out the sentence handed down more than a decade earlier. When the evening of the execution arrived, the families of McFadden's victims gathered at the Huntsville unit to witness the end of the man who had destroyed their lives. The Los Angeles Times reported that Suzanne Harrison's mother and brother were among those present, seated behind the glass partition that separated the condemned man from the witnesses. For them, the moment was heavy with both grief and grim anticipation. The execution would not bring their loved ones back, but it promised a sense of finality after years of anguish. Their faces reflected the complicated emotions of families who had waited more than 13 years to see justice carried out. When asked if he had a final statement, McFadden declined to speak. According to the Los Angeles Times, he offered no final words, no apology, and no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. The silence was striking. In a place where many condemned prisoners use their last moments to apologize, profess innocence, or speak to their families, McFadden chose instead to leave the world without saying anything at all. His silence became his final act, a stark contrast to the loud violence of the life he had lived. Moments later, the lethal injection was administered. Witnesses recalled that McFadden closed his eyes as the chemicals entered his system, and within minutes he was pronounced dead. The Los Angeles Times noted that his execution was carried out smoothly and without incident, marking the end of a man long regarded as one of Texas's most dangerous predators. In the aftermath, reactions from the public and the media reflected both relief and lingering sorrow. For many in East Texas, McFadden's execution symbolized long overdue justice, while for legal observers, it stood as a reminder of how a repeat offender had slipped through the cracks of parole and probation systems until it was far too late. Journalists covering the execution highlighted the irony that McFadden's silence at the end contrasted so sharply with the screams and terror that had defined his crimes, while law enforcement officials emphasized that his death brought closure not only to the families of Suzanne Harrison, Gena Turner, and Bryan Boone, but eventually, through DNA evidence, to the family of Anna Marie Hlavka as well. For those families, McFadden's execution was not a victory, but the closing of a painful chapter that had lasted far too long. This brings us to the end of Jerry Walter McFadden's haunting story, a case that reminds us of the devastating impact of unchecked violence, the persistence of law enforcement, and the importance of never forgetting the victims whose lives were cut short. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe justice was truly served in this case, and what lessons should the system learn from it? Share your views in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime stories, and subscribe to the True Crime Report Network for more in-depth documentaries on the cases that continue to shape America's understanding of crime and justice.